Hi. I'm just a little concerned. Last night I watched the Afterward program, and I saw a man with a strange name, Skekelbeck. He was interviewed by Ted Grandy, and he talked about the horrible Muslim threat in this country.
Right.
And he used so many inflammatory words, and there were many of his facts that were just wrong. Any 75-year-old news junkie like myself,
we applaud
who
news
keeps
junkies,
themselves informed, knew that there were so many errors. And, you know, I look at the King Committee in Congress that tried to investigate Muslims. I look at this, and now I see you. I know that many of you are very hooked up with David Horowitz, who runs around with a, you know, McCarthy-style attitude to American universities. And I see that you are with Fox News. I think that it would be a shame for a few Muslims, criminals, to begin to characterize a whole community as terrorists. And I think this is a danger that we have to look to because, you know, there was a Japanese internment during the Second World War. We did genocide on the Indians. We are not an innocent people when it comes to scapegoating.
I'm glad you raised that question, because what you'll see in this book is that I lay out a very factual case against Anwar al-Awlaki and those who follow his ideology of hate. And I'm glad you raised that question because in my conversations with the British equivalent of their Homeland Security Secretary, and they've been dealing with this problem a lot longer, he said to me, you know, Catherine, we've got to figure out where to draw the line. And he said, in the UK and Great Britain, we've decided that we're not going to use religion to draw this line. We're going to draw the line and say the terrorists on one side and everyone else is on the other side. And I think you make a good point that there is an effort to use religion as a wedge between us, and we have to avoid that.
Catherine Herridge with Fox News. She's the author of the book, The Next Wave on the Hunt for Al-Qaeda's American Recruits. How do you find that balance between protecting civil liberties and the rights of Muslims and the rights of immigrants, as well as second-generation Americans, and doing the investigative work that you're doing? Because one of the nuances of what you're talking about is looking at Muslims who are oftentimes second-generation. Perhaps they were born here. So how do you do this work without stereotyping?
Oh, in terms of the investigation itself? In my work, I just follow wherever the facts lead, because I cover a 10-year period with Anwar al-Awlaki and his followers. Some of them are converts to Islam, there is no question, but I would argue that the Islam that they are practicing is not the Islam of most Muslim Americans. This is, as I call it, sort of a digital jihad or an ideology of hate. And I can tell you that when you look at Anwar al-Awlaki, what you see is someone who leads a very double life. And one of the things I try and lay out in the book is that in many respects this man is a fraud, whether it was defrauding us of $20,000 to go to school here, pretending that he couldn't remember the hijackers from San Diego, which is what he did with the FBI, and perhaps first and foremost that when he lived here in the United States he had quite a long rap sheet. This was a man who on the one hand was presenting himself as an imam, and then on the other hand was being picked up for soliciting prostitutes in San Diego and for loitering around a school. Similar charge here in the Washington, D.C. area. And one of the threads in the book is I'm sort of on a search for his mugshots, because you can get a mugshot of almost every Hollywood celebrity, but you can't seem to get a mugshot of a guy who's on the CIA's killer capture list. And one of the questions I ask is, why is it that the government doesn't make better use of this information to discredit him? Because this would seem to be an obvious way to do that. And in the book, I interview a young man who had worshipped at his mosque in San Diego, and he says very clearly in the book that Anwar al-Awlaki is giving American Muslims a bad name. So I think the book is very fair in that respect.
And how do you think about, or what, because you do give opinions in this book about your, you do weigh in. There's the voice of the reporter, and there's also the voice of kind of analysis.
Right.
So how do you, as a correspondent, think about protecting civil liberties and protecting people in the way that Judith brought up, making sure that things don't go too far as typing?
Well, I don't think there's a moment in the book where I'm not drawing on my factual account and what I've been able to find. And one of the things I lay out in the book is that after Fort Hood, it took the administration the better part of 2 months to call it an act of terrorism. And I clearly argue, in terms of my own opinion, that Fort Hood was not a drive-by shooting or a 7-Eleven shooting. It was clearly something else, and it fits the definition of an act of violence to reach a political ends.
Let's go to Mission Hills, California. Charles, Republican caller. Hi there.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
My comment is I just watched an earlier program about the debt crisis and how we can bring home our troops and not have to fight these terrorist wars overseas. Are we at an advantage now that we'll be able to bolster our borders here, bring our troops, be able to watch what goes on within the country, and keep an eye on these homegrown terrorists?
That's a good question. One of the things I lay out in the book is really where the war on terror is going next. And I think if you want to understand where it's going and probably what it's going to take to win it, this would be a book you want to get. Because what I show is that terrorism in many respects is like water. It takes the path of least resistance, and we're dealing with a thinking enemy. So you move one way and it moves another. And what we've seen since 9/11 is that Al-Qaeda, which was traditionally in Pakistan, we now see these franchise operations which have popped up in Yemen, which is where they have the American, and also in Somalia, and then you have this homegrown component. So in many respects, the threat is more complex and it's more diverse, because on 9/11, Al-Qaeda was like a Fortune 500 company with Osama bin Laden as the CEO, and now it's much more of a franchise operation. And I know since bin Laden's death, there are 3 areas that the U.S. intelligence community is looking at very hard. Number 1, were there plots in the pipeline before his death? Number 2, will homegrown, I'll say, or sleeper cells use his death as a justification to launch attacks as we get towards the 10th anniversary of 9/11? Or will these affiliates in countries like Somalia and Yemen kind of step up to fill the void? So I don't think it's as simple as we pull down troops or resources from one area and then we can bring it into the United States. Unfortunately, the people who are making decisions on these issues right now really face some very tough challenges.
Catherine Herridge, you just outlined the 3 big concerns that authorities have. But take us through the translation of what that might mean for life in America, as far as what are the concerns about places that could be attacked, vulnerable positions. How do you prepare if, like you said, it takes like water the path of least resistance?
Well, look at this case we had last week in Seattle. This is a case where we had 2 young men. It's alleged that they wanted to launch an attack on a military installation near Fort Lewis in Seattle. And one of them, at the very least, was inspired by this cleric in Yemen. And he was angry, in fact, that the administration had put him on this hit list, the CIA killer capture list. Now, the reason that these 2 men were stopped is that they went to purchase weapons and someone was suspicious of what they were doing and stepped up and alerted the authorities. So one of the things I lay out in the book is that the future may not be a series of 9/11s. It may, in fact, be a series of smaller scale attempts on the United States and hopefully not successful attempts on the United States. And it's no accident over the last couple of months that if you go on to these jihadist websites, the thing that they're supporting is what I would call the small scale or individual jihad. I think it's a sign of, in some respects, the disintegration of Al-Qaeda proper in Pakistan, but it's also a sign that they believe that this ideology that they've been successfully able to create on the internet has found a very small minority of people in this country, but nevertheless it has gotten some traction with them.
Story from ABC News: alleged plot against U.S. military base in Seattle is the 8th in 2 years. In the latest planned assault on a U.S. military installation, at least the 8th such conspiracy in the past 2 years, 2 Islamic converts have been arrested for allegedly plotting a Fort Hood-style attack on a Seattle center for new military recruits.
Well, this is the very story that I'm talking about, and this particular case is concerning because it was disrupted just by not because the FBI was aware of them at that time, but because someone stepped forward, which is, of course, the right thing to do. But I would just point out that there's some cases that have been very much under the radar in this country. In the summer of 2009, there was an attack on a recruitment center in Arkansas. I'm sure you remember it. The young man who is the alleged shooter in that case is a convert who, guess what, traveled to Yemen and spent 18 months there and disappeared into the training camps there. And Senator John Kerry and the Foreign Relations Committee have an excellent report that they did over a year ago called Yemen, the Ticking Time Bomb, which catalogs the number of Americans who have traveled to Yemen and also the number of prison converts that have traveled to Yemen as well.
Let's go to Seattle, Washington, where Ed is calling on the Democrats line. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning.
Good morning. You know, I live in South Seattle, and I live very close to where the Islamic Center is, and I probably have seen these guys that were plotting. What I wanted to say was just a general comment to the American people. It has nothing to do with the terrorists or anything like that. It has to do with our foreign policy. We support the monarchs and the despots of the Middle East and our support for Israel. If you listen to what they were saying, they do have a point. It has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with our policies. So without a change in these policies, what's going to happen is this will continue. So I just want everyone to just try to read and understand everything that you can about the Middle East and what our foreign policy is doing.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point. I would like to give you an illustration from my book, which I think tells people what they need to know about individuals who have really bought into this sort of hateful way of life. I was in Guantanamo Bay, and it was one of the last court appearances for the 9/11 suspects before the Attorney General announced that they would be going to a federal court in the Southern District of New York, which was ultimately reversed. And one of the men, not a household name, Wally bin Attash, his family and Osama bin Laden's family are friends, so he's kind of like al-Qaeda royalty. In the military court at Guantanamo Bay, he takes the legal pad from his defense table and he makes this paper airplane and he shoots it across the courtroom at one of his co-conspirators, al-Baluchi. And I see Baluchi open this airplane and both men start laughing. And I say to myself, I got to find out what was going on there. And I later learned that on the inside of that paper airplane, bin Attash had either written the flight numbers for 9/11 or the tail numbers for the jets. So for me, that image of the military court and a paper airplane and these two 9/11 suspects, in effect mocking us 7, 8 years after the attacks, this to me at least was a real window onto who these people are.
Catherine Herridge from Fox News, where she's a national correspondent. Her new book is called The Next Wave, on the hunt for al-Qaeda's American recruits. One of our followers on Twitter wants to know, says this, ask why she thinks the terrorists attack us. Please ask her why she thinks they hate us. And this gets to the question our last caller asked. Let's just start there with that question on Twitter.
Well, I think, you know, part of the book, what I try to do is take you along on this investigation. So you go to the interviews with me, you go through the documents with me, and we kind of discover the story about the cleric and his followers together. So it's not a dry academic read. It's very much like an action adventure. And I'm not suggesting people sit down and read his stuff on the internet, but it might be actually not a bad idea, because once you start to read his writings and you listen to his videos, you see that Anwar al-Awlaki is incredibly effective. And in my opinion, what he does is he effectively breaks down this cultural identity of people who are American citizens and makes them feel ultimately like victims. And this is the justification for this sort of launching out, or lashing out rather, against the United States. It's a very hard idea to get your mind around, and that's one of the reasons I told that story, is because when you see these guys in court and you see how they behave, you know, you don't need much of a gut check to know that they are not like us, and they don't think like us, and they certainly don't respect our civil liberties and the freedoms that we have. So I think this is a great question, and I think it's a question we're all still trying to answer, but what's clear to me is that the driver of all of this is the internet and all of those associated capabilities. And in some respects, though Anwar al-Awlaki is on the CIA's killer capture list, in many ways it's going to be hard to erase this legacy of hate that he has created.
CW is a Republican calling from Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think that it would be a shame for a few Muslims, criminals, to begin to characterize a whole community as terrorists. And I think this is a danger that we have to look to because, you know, there was a Japanese internment during the Second World War. We did genocide on the Indians. We are not an innocent people when it comes to scapegoating.
I'm glad you raised that point, that there is an effort to use religion as a wedge between us, and we have to avoid that.
Catherine Herridge with Fox News. She's the author of the book, The Next Wave on the Hunt for Al-Qaeda's American Recruits. How do you find that balance between protecting civil liberties and the rights of Muslims and the rights of immigrants, as well as second-generation Americans, and doing the investigative work that you're doing? Because one of the nuances of what you're talking about is looking at Muslims who are oftentimes...
Hi. I'm just a little concerned. Last night I watched the Afterward program and I saw a man with a strange name, Skeckleback. He was interviewed by Ted Grandy, and he talked about the horrible Muslim threat in this country.
Right.
And he used so many inflammatory words, and there were many of his facts that were just wrong. Any 75-year-old...
Because what you'll see in this book is that I lay out a very factual case against Anwar al-Awlaki and those who follow his ideology of hate. And I'm glad you raised that question because in my conversations with the British equivalent of their Homeland Security Secretary, and they've been dealing with this problem a lot longer, he said to me, you know, Catherine, we've got to figure out where to draw the line. And he said, in the UK and Great Britain, we've decided that we're not going to use religion to draw this line. We're going to draw the line and say the terrorists on one side and everyone else is on the other side. And I think you make a good point.
News junkie like myself.
We applaud news
keep
junkies.
Themselves informed, knew that there were so many errors. And, you know, I look at the King Committee in Congress that tried to investigate Muslims. I look at this, and now I see you. I know that many of you are very hooked up with David Horowitz, who runs around with a, you know, McCarthy-style attitude to American universities. And I see that you are with Fox News.